have their own defense, both for internal support during crises and as well as obviously protecting its own country. Right now, it's been decimated. Israel has probably took out about 80, almost 90% of their military capacity. Obviously, from their perspective, they didn't want any of those falling in the hands of a group they have not yet come to trust, and obviously has jihadist links, as you already mentioned. But that needs to be rebuilt. The other part is you really want to integrate all of these armed groups that aren't necessarily part of the government, because the government is just being formed. They need to be included. If they're not included, you're going to leave all these highly trained individuals who are very capable, like the SDF, without another means of support other than their current situation. And if we're going to have a full Syria, that should be something that's the aim should be to integrate the military eventually. Often jihadist groups fight each other. It doesn't mean they're not jihadist. It just means they're trying to fight for the same territory or people. But we don't know yet. He is saying the right things, but there's a lot of indications that from past history and just from his actions, he's essentially appointing people in government already without going through a process that allowed the Syrian people to choose their elected leaders and then appoint people that they felt are most competent. But right now, I think the international community should be willing to come in very strongly with humanitarian aid, reconstruction support, if the government goes to being all inclusive. If they don't, we're going to have essentially a current version of Syria, which is not Syria. We have sections of the country that are run by other non-governmental groups, including the one the U.S. works with, the SDF. And this is going to be the case throughout Syria if they don't actually include everyone. It's going to say segregated.
HTS is currently in the process of absorbing different military forces into a new Syrian army. What progress has been made, and does it look like it's working and it can work?
So there's two, of course, really important parts in trying to integrate the army. The first is every nation needs a military. They need to have their own defense, both for internal support during crises and as well as obviously protecting its own country. Right now, it's been decimated. Israel has probably took out about 80, almost 90% of their military capacity. Obviously, from their perspective, they didn't want any of those falling in the hands of a group they have not yet come to trust, and obviously has jihadist links, as you already mentioned. But that needs to be rebuilt. The other part is you really want to integrate all of these armed groups that aren't necessarily part of the government, because the government is just being formed. They need to be included. If they're not included, you're going to leave all these highly trained individuals who are very capable, like the SDF, without another means of support other than their current situation. And if we're going to have a full Syria, that should be something that's the aim should be to integrate the military eventually.
So that kind of brings me to my next question. Where does this all leave the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army and the opposing Syrian Democratic Forces backed by the US?
So it has been a challenge, for many years. When I was in the Pentagon, this was a challenge. We feel, the U.S., particularly the Pentagon, feels that the partners that we have had in the SDF were directly, obviously, responsible for the defeat of ISIS. In fact, they did 90% of the fighting. Most of the U.S. military efforts is enabling, whether it's intelligence or advisory or air support or artillery support, but essentially combat support. The SDF did most of the fighting and obviously took most of the casualties, and they were successful. We need to remember that. The enduring defeat of ISIS, because ISIS could look at this whole event, toppling of the Assad regime, as an opportunity. The enduring defeat is going to be on SDF. So we need to ensure that we maintain our presence there, in my opinion. We have about 900 servicemen and women there from the U.S. But that could be challenged in an incoming Trump administration. But that's always a balance with Turkey, our NATO ally, who has a different view of our partner, obviously. And we need to balance that. I've always thought that one of our best arguments toward Turkey is it's always better to have the U.S. with who you perceive as a potential, or at least connected to a potential adversary of them, PKK, a designated terrorist group. It's better to have the U.S. with elements of the Kurdish factions, because that would make it much less likely, particularly that those groups would do anything against Turkey, and they haven't. They haven't done. The SDF, for example. Often, which is not talked about when it comes to the SDF, is a large portion of them are Arabs. They talk about the leadership, YPG, the Kurdish part. Obviously, one of the reasons why they're so effective, they're really good fighters. But deliberately, the SDF does include a lot of Arabs. And that's it's not just a Kurdish force, although it's kind of like shorthanded a lot in the media that it's.
What do you think will happen, though, if the incoming Donald Trump as president does decide to withdraw US forces from Syria?
Well, that could do a couple things. It could, allow ISIS to potentially regain a foothold and try to reconstitute itself. SDF is very good, but they need these enablers. They don't have an air force. They don't have anything close to the level of intelligence collection capability that the United States and our allies have, and it doesn't have, quite frankly, the combat support network like we do, whether it's artillery of any sort. So that will be a challenge to them. Also, Turkey might look at it as an opportunity to start taking back terrain that they being the SDF, currently occupy, which would, from their point of view, require them to go focus on that. Again, taking their eye off the ball of ISIS. So it has a lot of potential pitfalls. I can understand the U.S. and I've been one of them, and my son's one of them. That's been deployed. The U.S. military has been deployed for quite some time in conflict zones, but it's beneficial to U.S. national security, regional national security of Europe, our partners, our NATO partners, for the U.S. to have a forward presence. It does change the battlefield, for our partners for the better. So it is. It may be tough to convince the isolationist parts of some of our political uh, factions back in the United States, but I still think there's a core of both parties that understands that this isn't just benevolency. It's also in our own interest to ensure, one, that there's not a massive exodus of Syrians that are going to head toward Europe again. We've all seen that already happen. Two, that ISIS doesn't reconstitute itself, and then when they do, start looking at external targets, which is likely going to be our partners and allies.
Interesting, given everything that you have said, when HTS says Syria's future will be decided by the Syrians, it doesn't seem like that's the case at all.
You would hope it would be. The Assyrian people have gone through 5 decades of oppression, 13 years of a brutal civil war, hundreds of thousands killed, millions displaced, that they would want a stable government that focused more inward in the sense that they're looking at how to improve the lot of the Syrian people and less allowing other countries to come in, like Iran, for example, and use them as a launch point for their covert operations throughout the region. That's going to be tough. There's a lot of countries, including the U.S., so we do have a presence there, but also all the countries that neighbor it, Jordan, obviously Israel, Lebanon, they all have a stake, as well as Europe and all the countries in the Gulf countries. Everybody is going to play a part in the solution, so everybody is going to have some part of the say in how that will be. But ultimately, it should be the Syrian people that make that determination, and then the government should respond, react, and focus on the Syrian people themselves.
And the interim government is expected to be in place for 3 months, at which time it's hoped elections will be held. Do you think that's too long?
It would really come down to the experts to know how long it would be to hold an election in a war-torn country like Syria. That should be the case. If this is in some way an extended transition period, so the people become ingrained and the people just accept that those unelected, and then appointed people are the government, that looks like it was a backsliding from what HTS and Jelani specifically said was going to happen. So the international community should look at just how long it would take to hold a valid election and then really push for that to be the time.
So it is potentially reasonable to set that time scale.
It could be. I mean, holding international elections right after a civil war that was this devastating, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure there are people in the UN that focus on international elections and the validity of them. They could do an assessment and come up with a time frame that would be reasonable.